good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Deborah Spitz. I'm at the U.S. Department of Education. I'll be moderating and I will introduce our panelists in a moment. This is the panel on locally selected, nationally recognized assessments. And we wanted to just start off, since this is something that's new, and I'm trying to figure out where the best place is to stand, but we wanted to just give you a kind of a basic outline of what this new authority is, or new, we call it a flexibility. It's something you can do, but it's not something that you need to do. So since you're here, I'm assuming you're interested in it, and we're going to ask a little bit. We're curious who's in our audience, but we're going to ask you about that in a bit. But I wanted to just start off by just telling you a little bit about this requirement, and then our esteemed panel will talk in more detail. So first thing to know is this is something states can choose to do. They can, or they could choose not to do it. You know, we know some of you are getting pressure from various places to do it, and that's okay too, but it is a state's choice. So basically the state will set certain criteria, and then it means that that LEAs could apply to use not any assessment, but certain assessments that meet the state's criteria. And then the key thing to know too is it's not any school within an LEA, it's not any student within a school, it's an LEA choosing to offer an assessment across its LEA. So if it's a high school assessment, it's to all the high school students in that LEA. So as you see on this slide, that goes to the importance of comparability and being able to compare data. So we get a lot of questions about the definition of a locally selected, nationally recognized high school academic assessment, and this is the definition. It's an assessment of high school students' knowledge and skills. I feel like this is echoing a little bit. Does it sound okay?
Yes, I'm at the mic. So,
Yeah,
try to talk about it.
Okay. Anyway, you all can read the slide, but it's an assessment of high school students' knowledge and skills administered in multiple states, recognized by institutions of higher education in those or other states for the purposes of entrance or placement into courses in post-secondary education or training programs. So that's a mouthful. That's our definition. And this is all coming from our assessment regulations. And what we're going to talk about today, we're going to focus on these items on this slide and the things that are in the guide that you all got this morning or you've seen online. And it's section 7 of the guide of the critical elements. It's a new section. One thing that before we get started I want to emphasize is that when we're talking about peer review for the locally selected, nationally recognized high school assessments, what you're going to need to do is submit it for peer review. You're going to need to submit all the other sections as well. So we get a lot of questions about this. It's not just section 7, it's section 7 plus all the other things that apply to every other assessment. So that's just something to be aware of. So basically that is the overview. There are also the state has some monitoring requirements and some parental notification requirements. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I will introduce our panel, and then they will all speak to you about different aspects of this requirement, or this flexibility. Our first speaker is going to be Tammy Howard, and Tammy is the Director of Accountability Services for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. She oversees the development and administration of the statewide assessment program and the accountability and reporting system. And she has 20 years of experience in assessment development, delivery, and administration. Then we're going to move to Vince Verges, who is here. He's the Assistant Deputy Commissioner at the Florida Department of Education. He's served in Florida's public education system for 26 years as a high school math teacher, adjunct college math instructor, elementary school assistant principal, and now oversees Florida's K-12 and post-secondary assessment systems. And then last but not least, we have John Olson, who is the president of Olson Educational Measurement and Assessment Services and senior partner for the Assessment Solutions Group. And he has more than 30 years of experience providing consulting on a variety of measurement and statistical issues for international, national, and state and assessment programs. So you can see we have a wealth of experience on our panel, and I will turn it over to them. I'm going to start with Tammy. Tammy, could you speak about what states will be responsible for if they choose to implement the locally selected, nationally recognized flexibility? And what are some challenges that they should be prepared for?
Okay, thank you. Thank you and good afternoon. I think that it helps to kind of think about this in the context of, particularly if North Carolina were to do this. We develop our own assessments in North Carolina through a partnership with North Carolina State University. So we very much, from the very beginning, the inception of the design, all the way through to the end, are responsible for everything pertaining to those assessments, and then the reporting out of those assessments as well. So many of you, are used to working with a vendor. To me, this is one step away from that even, and that this is already a product, a packaged product that, as Deborah said, has to be attended to by the first 6 sections, as would any assessment. But when you get to section 7, the difference to me is that it's then saying to the states, what are you going to do? What are the steps you have to go through to make sure that you're attending to the aspects of this that possibly the vendor of a locally nationally recognized assessment may not have attended to. So they have this packaged product that can do X, Y, Z, but are they looking at the bigger context with how this is actually going to have an input both in your state and as well in the district? And just before I get to the particulars, I will share that North Carolina, in our conversations around this, we have really always come back to the issue of we're trying to make comparisons across districts to how students are doing. And when we have some districts that might possibly avail themselves of a different assessment, then how can we make those comparisons? So I think that's a big first consideration for states to consider as they do this. But having said that, when you look at section 7.1 and 7.2, which are the two that I'm going to address, the first piece, of course, is about the alignment study. And of course, we're conducting alignment studies for all of our assessments. But then we're also coming back in this situation to an assessment that's already built to content standards, to specifications, and then looking to see how it lines up with an individual state's content standards. And the expectation is the same in that alignment study, in that we're looking to see the degree to which that assessment lines up with the state-adopted content standards. And what is going to happen, once that degree, if it's established that it's closer or is farther away than one would have anticipated. And of course, what we must do with our assessments typically is we have had one time in the history of our program where we did have to go back and change some items on an assessment to fulfill some observations that were made in the alignment study. But in this situation, a state may or may not have the opportunity to do this because, again, we would expect these assessments are built and they are what they are. So I think that's an important consideration for a state to have. How is it going to address if there are any differences between the alignment study results in the assessment? Then what would the response be? And particularly in thinking about how would that be communicated, not only for peer review, which is a very important piece, the response for peer review, but also to the public that is expecting something from those assessments and is expecting that those assessments are measuring the state-adopted content standards. Because we've talked about that for many, many, many years, the importance of doing that. And so then to step away from that, I think that's a response that states would need to be prepared for. The other requirement that we see here is that the states have to have a process to include all students in the assessment, other than those students who are, of course, participating in an alternate assessment that's aligned to alternate academic achievement standards. So on the face value, that one would seem simple enough to do, but with more district latitude in this particular assessment, then we may need to think about evidence that we would provide to show that we're still monitoring that. So crossing that line, particularly with a district, that yes, possibly the district's making this decision, that they're going to administer this locally, nationally recognized assessment, but on the other hand, are they doing it in such a way that they're making sure that they're assessing all students? So the state is still responsible for that, and that would be included in the state's process, and the evidence would be expected in peer review to show that that is being done. And I'll probably mention monitoring a couple more times, but that really does speak to monitoring. And I think through our conversations and preparing for the panels, one of the messages, and I think it was said this morning, is that monitoring is really for all assessments, not just the general assessments, but also the alternate assessments, also for the accommodations, also for this assessment, monitoring to go and see what exactly is happening to make sure that things are happening the way we would expect them to. And I think the previous plenary, one of the panelists said that when they did that, they found that things were not as they thought they actually should be. So again, the state has to have a process in place to make sure that this is happening. And then the last part of 7.1 speaks to the accommodation and the equal benefits. So that one gave me pause, and I think even on our prep call, I think at one point I said, what really are we talking about there? So we have a national assessment. We administer it at the district level. How do we make sure that all students have equal benefit from participating in that assessment? And it goes back really to the issue with that these assessments are, prepackaged potentially, I would think, and in that they already have their criteria to which they have been built. And so what, of course, this reminds us of is accommodations and other situations where students may find themselves in a situation where they may not be able to have the same benefit from participating in that assessment as other students do. So that could be very concerning. It would be something that the state would want to address and make sure that it's covering how it's going to handle that. That kind of leads into 7.2 that talks about parental notification. That is key to make sure that parents understand and that in the peer review process that there's evidence of making sure that they're informed. And if you'll notice in 7.1, it really says that has to happen, that notification. The process has to have that happen before the district actually administers the assessment. So it's not an afterthought. Is before it ever actually gets to that process, that it can make sure that it's going to cover and include all of the students and inform the parents. And of course, across assessment, the importance of sharing information with parents comes up again and again and again. And particularly, I think, in the complex world that we live in now with assessments, with opportunity, that it's very critical that we have very clear systems in place. North Carolina is a very large state. And even with a small state, I'm sure it's most challenging to have consistent communication from one level to the next level over time. And so this is one that I think would be very critical. I know this morning in a session we mentioned actually having as evidence letters, for example, that go to parents. And of course the challenge then is having letters that really explain everything very, very clearly so they understand what their options are. So it's very key to also have the communication so that it's how it is communicated and to make sure that it's communicated effectively. One note, of course, and I think it's already been said, is that all schools in the district have to participate in this if the district does choose to do that. That's critical to make sure that the process includes that and that there's evidence of that and that there's not differences among there. Going back to the overall importance of this, and I think 7.1 and 7.2, it's interesting, of course, methodically they come at the end because it is the next section, but really this section is really the beginning. It's not the end. Really, all of this needs to happen prior to really even the decision to move forward, is to map this out and think about how this will play out once it actually does get to the district level. And in my personal experience, I would feel as though, I'm sure it varies by state, varies by districts. I'm sure some districts would really love to avail themselves of this opportunity. But I think it would also be very helpful to share with them that there is this peer review requirement, because we could commit to the districts to let them have this opportunity. They could set it all up. We could go through the process. And then, as we all know, once we get to peer review, there may be something that has to be corrected, either in the process or in the way the information is reported, the accommodations. There could be a hiccup. And I think to share that with the districts, to make sure they know going in that this is not just a matter of signing up for a nationally recognized assessment and going from that point forward, that this is going to require evidence that all of these things are met and that they are thought out, and that we are making sure that it is consistent from district to district, because we all are coming back ultimately to that point of really the need here is to see how districts are doing with their students and how the schools are doing with their students, but also at the state level, there's that interest in having that comparability. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. So one thing we wanted to, each of our panelists is going to talk on slightly different issues, so we wanted to just check in with you after each speaker to see if you have questions. I also wanted to mention too that we have index cards in your folders, so if somebody doesn't feel like raising their hand or standing up at the mic, that's okay. You can either hand us a card or you can even wave it in the air and I'll come get it. But we're a pretty small group, so this, feel free to ask questions. And we first, okay, one thing I did want to touch on that I didn't cover in the opening, the peer review requirement is actually a little bit different from the regular peer review requirement, and I want to make sure that I leave you being aware of that. For locally selected, nationally recognized, if you as a state choose to implement this, you actually have to come in for peer review before you implement this in your LEAs. So that's a difference from the regular peer review. Otherwise, it's a similar process. We encourage you to just, as I said this morning, if this is something you're thinking about, we encourage you to talk to us about it. And on that note, we as a panel were interested to know who's in the room. So I wanted to just take a moment to see, who do we have from, do we have SEAs? Do we have people from state departments of ed here that know that you're interested in doing this, the locally selected? Yes? Okay, that's, and are there folks here from state departments of ed who are just thinking about it? You just want to hear more about what's involved?
Yeah, I think we wanted to be prepared in case we were asked.
Yeah. Did you want to ask the group any questions?
No, that's,
Okay.
that helps.
Do you want to, and since we have this awkward seating
What I'd like
thing,
to
so.
do, if you could tilt the lid down just a little bit, I would like to, I can stand here because I need to look at my screen. I'm a visual person. And I will,
There's a lot of slides.
too late. So, and the other thing is I got this great bionic hand that I use that I can just turn off and I can speak with my other hand. So, tilt it down just a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm missing one person here.
Oh, I see.
There she is. Now I can
Okay.
see. The only person I couldn't see.
We did want
So-
to see if anyone had questions, so, do we want to
Oh,
just see,
questions
did
for
anyone
Melissa.
have-
Questions from,
For Tammy,
I'm sorry, Tam, I'm sorry.
yeah.
I'm thinking
Did
different
anyone
person.
have questions they wanted to ask right now? Yes.
If we're looking at nationally recognized assessments, how different would we expect the peer review information to be from state to state if they're referring to, say, the same assessment? They want to use SAT, for example, in math.
That's a really great question. If something has been peer reviewed, we have a memo that we linked to this morning that references this. But if it's a test that's been peer reviewed already, we will treat that like we treat any other consortium assessment. And by that we mean, let's say the ACT, for example, it's been through peer review, but not for your state. So you would be responsible for all the state items. as part of that peer review, and of course, the Section 7 items.
Deborah, I have a question. You mentioned something that we need to go through this process before we administer. Did I hear that wrong?
No, you heard that right. And so you would need to come to us for peer review before you make it available to your LEAs to use. So we know the timing of that is sensitive, and that's why we do encourage you to come to us. You know, obviously, we don't hold peer review all the time. We will make exceptions if a state, you know, so talk to us about when that would happen, but it does need to come to us for peer review before it goes to the LEAs.
7 then?
No, it would be the whole thing. But again, if it's a test that's been assessed, been peer reviewed already, we would incorporate that peer review. Okay, thanks.
Okay. I've spoken about the study that Florida did twice previously at the Tulsa meeting last spring and then at NCSA this past summer. So anybody didn't hear one or both of those? Haven't heard that spiel? Okay. Which is great because I'm going to approach it a little bit differently than I did previously. So this is good for the folks who've already heard me at least once, and then great for the folks who haven't heard me previously. So Florida, unlike many times legislatures do things without really thinking about them and taking care of due diligence and so forth. But Florida legislators, because there had been a lot of discussion around using some other locally selected, nationally recognized assessment in lieu of our statewide test, they said, let's do a study. So last legislative session, they passed the bill, and we knew all along we had the benefit of thinking that this thing was going, so I was already thinking about it. When the bill finally became law last March, I quickly wrote an RFP, and it was easy because the law was very specific. It wanted to look only at SAT and ACT, only in comparison to our 10th grade ELA test and our Algebra 1 EOC. So there's a consideration that I think is important for other states to think about. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then also the law itself. The ESSA law that has this requirement is very structured. It's very prescriptive. All the way down, I think one of the most important elements is that this assessment has to match the state's assessment at each achievement level. So that tells you how deep you have to dig into it. The RFP talked about alignment to the standards, comparability for results, accommodations, how the test fits within your accountability system if you do decide to use this, and whether the test will pass peer review. So I'm going to skip ahead to the end where the findings were, this is a really bad idea as Florida envisions it. But that doesn't help the states that are saying, but we have to do this. So how many states the law says you shall do this? How many states have that as their law? You are going to do this, you don't have a choice. Or you're going to, okay. So unlike my last preview, here's the Florida example, but for the question that I got at the end of CCSO came from Jeff Nelhouse, who I knew from my Park days when he was in Massachusetts, then with Park, now with Centerpoint. Jeff asked a good question. He said, Vince, what would you do if the legislature came back and said, do this? And so I'm trying to talk to you. What would we do? And I'll kind of touch on those things, and I won't steal some of John's thunder because he can talk about some details. Clearly, we would have to talk about a wider range of tests, not just our Algebra 1 test, because we also have a geometry test. We have a grade 9 ELA test. So we might ask the legislators, if they were going to put this in the law, to stretch the comparability. Let's look at all the high school tests. And then the comparability piece, we have 5 achievement levels. I don't know of the states that are out there. The more achievement levels you have, the more of a challenge you're going to have meeting that comparability across those achievement levels. We'd have to look at that. We did some equipercentile linking. Again, I'll leave some of that to John to talk about. We would have to think about maybe going back to standard setting and looking at standards, maybe fewer achievement levels, and looking at the standards and the performance on the assessment for ACT and SA, or whatever other, it doesn't have to be ACT or SAT, whatever tests were chosen across the performance continuum, and look at them in conjunction. We certainly would have to change our accountability model. We have a student to get a diploma has to pass the grade 10 ELA test and the Algebra 1 end of course assessment. If you're in a district that doesn't have those tests, what are you going to say about that? So it's doable. And my answer to Jeff was, you can do anything. If the legislature says do it, you're going to do it. And I also think, I won't speak for the department, but I think the department, this has been an option that's put out there. I think within the construct of peer review, the department, I would hope, would work with states to help make this work for you. So you just have to think about that. I would also say in the peer review piece, there were many of the critical elements that would be met. There are some big chunks, granted, there are some big chunks, but there are many elements of peer review that would be met right off the bat. And for example, I think accommodations were something that I think people have a lot of fear about, but I think we were closer there than in a lot of other areas. So it can be done. The other thing I would like to share, I don't want to take all the air out of the sails here, especially out of John's presentation, is some of the other resources. So I would definitely say, if you're thinking about this, if you haven't seen our study, it's online. It's with appendices, it's a couple hundred pages. The non-appendices are available on the website. And again, I don't think we have a vehicle to get the links, because I'm going to share some other resources and links to get those up so you can just find them without emailing. We can figure out how to get these to you. So the link to our studies there.
We can post things on our website,
Okay.
on the conference website.
Okay, so you can post the link, I'll get you the link to the study, and you can post that. Because the appendices are so big, there's some great data sets. We have about 200,000 kids per grade, so you have some great data sets there if you want to look at it for yourselves. You know, if you're just trying to help your policymakers understand the challenges, getting some of the condensed executive summaries and analyses, you can take a look there. The appendices are available upon request because they're too big to be, they're too hard to make ADA compliant, too big to be posted. But what we do is we've got them posted on a share file site, and so as people request them, we give them access to go pull the share file, and then you can, and just because it's on a secure share file site, once you get it, you can share it with whoever you want. So it's not a secure thing, it's just a size and ADA compliance issue. The other resource I want to talk about that I think is really valuable, and I'll plug it, CCSSO provided 2 documents. I work with the Center of Assessment, who they partner with to get this resource out there, and they are implementing locally selected, nationally recognized assessments. And they're 2 different documents. One of them was, let me pull it up to make sure I'm covering all the bases here. One of them was some of the big questions. You know, how do you go about setting this place? How do you communicate to SEAs what the options are? How do you help the SEAs, or LEAs, the LEAs communicate to parents? What's the best way to establish an implementation plan? Are you going to buy the test for the districts, or the district's going to buy the test? And districts don't have a lot of procurement experience for large-scale assessments. Are you going to offer them assistance? If the LEA is going to work with the vendor themselves, are you going to help them manage the program? They may not be able or very experienced with program management to manage the implementation by district of these assessments. And then what kind of things, if you have policymakers that are just thinking about it, what kind of things should your policymakers be looking at? So that one document is just, so you want to have locally selected, nationally recognized tests. Here's some things to think about. Then the other document is, if you're going down this path, here's a blueprint or a map to do this, and it's an implementation framework. It goes a little more detail about SCA and LEA communications, some more on how to do the procurement and contract management, certification of program management capacity, something you might want to make sure before a district says, yeah, we want to do this. Do you want to certify them in advance and say, are you really capable of managing this? Operational quality control, project, you don't just get the train out of the station, you got to help them keep the train on the tracks as you go. Some ways to help LEAs do that. And then, of course, many districts don't have the technical expertise to evaluate and monitor the technical quality of the assessments like they should, and help monitor the test administration. So those 2 documents, they're companion documents. There's also a third document, which is an executive summary. I think were really helpful, and I see some footprints of that documentation in Section 7. So I think US DOE maybe had referred to that, as well as some of the considerations. So those are some of the resources I thought about that would be most helpful to you. And some of the things from the implementation perspective, if you don't have a choice, here's some things that you want to think about as you might move forward with this. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm going to see if there's questions about the Florida study first. Anybody, did I leave any gaping details out that you're curious about? I think one of the things that you want to think about is, if you're using this in your accountability system, is if it is an SAT or ACT or any other test, what time frame do the students in these districts usually take those tests? You have to think about, if our 10th grade ELA test is taken when kids are in 10th grade, they might take the ACT or SAT at least a year, maybe 2 years later. How does that factor into your accountability system? Same thing, Algebra 1, we have kids that take Algebra 1 as early as 6th grade, which is part of our ESSA plan. So 6th, 7th grade, if they take the Algebra 1 test, or the geometry test in 7th grade, if you use those tests, and they don't take the ACT until later, how do you manage that? And another, do you let the districts pick just math? I think I heard somebody allude to that. Do they just want to give ACT for math? Do you want to allow that? Do you want to just give or can you deny them that? Or do they have to take both ELA and math and use both of those? So lots more questions to think about. Yes?
What's the name of the Florida study?
It is called officially, and you could Google this. It has a really great name. Feasibility of the use of the ACT and SAT in lieu of Florida statewide assessments. So you could FLDOE feasibility study and so forth. We didn't talk about, and John may talk about this, we didn't ask him to say, what happens if you do away with the state test and just pick one of these tests? We didn't do that because states are already doing that. We know if they just need to legislate it and make it happen. And then we'd be in the same boat as other states that are doing that. So. Question?
Yeah, Vince, was that study based on using locally selected or just replacing your statewide assessment for one of these?
It would be along the lines of the ESSA provision, where districts could decide whether to use the ACT or SAT, and other districts might pick the statewide test.
Okay, so it was in addition to, not in lieu of.
Right, in addition to, right? Because again, we could have asked that question, could we get rid of the state tests? But we wouldn't have to pay $400,000 to answer that question, because other states have already done it. And then our legislature would say, other states have done it, you guys go do it too. So. Has anybody here not heard of the CCSSO resource I mentioned? Was that something new to anybody here? You've seen that? Okay. Good, I'm glad, because it's a good resource.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. So now we'll go to John. And John, one of the requirements under this flexibility is that the assessment is equivalent to or more rigorous than the statewide assessment and produces comparable data. So based on your work in this area, what do you think states need to understand about this requirement?
Okay, so I'm primarily addressing critical element 7.3, comparability of the LSNRHSA. This is DC, right? Yeah, I don't know how to say it as a word, but, and I may not spell that out, or how about just LSNR? Anyway, there's a lot of parts to it. So Deborah's question, and especially what Vince just said, led to a lot of work. And let me give a little more context there. So that RFP that Vince wrote, or as he said, it wrote himself because of the law in the state of Florida, we bid on it, the group I work with, and won the contract, began the work in September, and had to deliver a report to the department and actually the state legislature by January 1. It was a very, very short time frame, a lot of work, and basically we had to use existing data and whatever, and the parameters as Vince spelled them out. The key thing that we worked on, there was a lot of things going on, was comparability issues. And that comparability included, of course, alignment studies, accommodations, and actually looking at test data and comparing scores for kids based on the best samples we could come up with, and seeing how they would perform using various statistical methods to link, equipercentile, or even simulate some data to try to put it all together. So I'll get back to that. And we're not talking findings in this presentation, mostly talking about the process and sort of the goals and how to get to those goals. So for, I don't know what it is, 6, 7 states that raise their hands, for your states that are thinking about this, you're going to have to do something kind of in this manner. So the basic thing is to empirically evaluate the evidence and run analyses of the rigor and quality of the various assessments you want. If the state is using its state assessment, that's sort of the baseline, and then you compare to the other 2 or 3 assessments, whatever your state's thinking about. I will call them Assessment A and Assessment B, since I'm not supposed to identify them. Hear that, Vince? Yes. Too late. Shouldn't be too much a hard guess for anybody to know. And if you open up that report, you'll know front and center. So anyway, what was needed was some studies done, or actually this is more general talk, and I'll tell you how we applied it. Because we did the work before this peer review guidance came out. We didn't know 7.3 from, anything. We just kind of put together, proposed a plan based on what the RFP needed and went with it. But anyway, going back to 7.3, what a state needs then is empirical studies or research or some sort of evaluations and analysis of this LSNR option to show that they do indeed provide comparable, valid, and reliable data. Now, how do you do that? So another requirement that the state needs to think about, again, I'm mostly wanting you to think about if you have to submit peer review evidence on this critical element, what are you going to be saying about these requirements? So you need to have some sort of analyses that provide information that the tests you want to use, this LSNR, they do provide unbiased data results, and they can fairly differentiate among students, schools, across the state assessment system. And this also means that each subgroups of students in your state too are being fairly assessed by these different tests and see where their performance lands. Okay, so what did we do? And I'm going to focus mostly on the comparability study aspect of it. There were these 5 parts as Vince described: alignment, accommodations, comparability, looking at impact on accountability reporting, and peer review. So the first thing that we did in the study, and you don't have to do it this way, this is just sort of giving you examples of things, but I would assume some of these are probably pretty straightforward. Evaluate the technical characteristics of the assessments that you want to use. And that included looking at content coverage, the types of items that each test provides, range of difficulties, reliability, standard errors of measurement, distributions of performance by subgroup, percents of students in each category in the achievement levels reported. Okay, that's quite a handful right there of a lot of things to look at, and it's for the 2 or 3 or more assessments that you want to have available as options for the districts. A key thing that was done to look and analyze at comparability of results was once we got the right samples and ran them through the analyses, we developed concordance tables to really look at how the students would fall depending on if they took test A, B, C, and just compare there, and then put together classification and decision consistency tables to summarize on how close they would be. And, well, I can't talk about the findings. I suggest you look at the report and see what's going on, but as to be expected on any two tests, even almost perfectly correlated tests, you don't always get 100% agreement on, where the kids are. If they took this test, this test, that test, and this other test, and, across a whole bunch of students, would they all always fall in the same cells or not? In other words, they perform at level 3 on that test. Do they perform at level 3 on that one and that one? There is some error, measurement error in there, especially at cut points and stuff, but you just need to look at that because that will tell you a lot about how comparable things are. What you don't want is have as an assessment that kids perform so much better on this one than this other one. Well, guess which test the districts will want to choose for their test. And you don't want one that penalizes kids either. So basically, the key evaluation of looking at all of this, the concordance tables, decision consistency and all that, is to determine the interchangeability of the test scores from the different tests. So, and I'm sure there's other methodologies to be used, and I didn't really want to go through all the details there. Again, I will point you to the reports that we did, and then look at how you might shape the findings in it. I did want to bring up one other thing, though. So we put all this different information together, and looking at comparability of the technical characteristics, of course, was a big one, and then how results would be reported, since every state has an accountability system, and that's pretty important on how that all comes out there. But for the study we did for Florida, we did a peer review. We called it the mock peer review. It was an internal one, but we had experts, including some people who have served as peer reviewers and others who are very familiar with the peer review process. And we took all the data. Florida gave us their peer review submission and results from 2 years ago. So we had that baseline again, and then the vendors involved in assessment A and assessment B kindly provided us with their information on if they hadn't submitted for peer review, here's what we're thinking about doing. If they had, well, we had the information there. We ran it through our group of internal peer reviewers and set it all up to say, okay, now how would this pass peer review based on our judgments? And the key thing in that process was we put together a big table, and it was basically just like the peer review tables that you see in the peer review guide. And here's the stuff, here's the evidence and all that. But we put it together, and the evidence was, okay, here's Florida's in one column, here's assessment A in this column, here's assessment B in that column, and then we had the peer reviewers basically fill in the columns what they saw. And yes, as Vince said, for most of the critical elements, most of the assessments passed. In certain ones, not so much. So you have to look at that and kind of weigh that too. Now, I'm not saying that's how the real peer review would turn out, but I think it's better that a recommendation here would be that if your state wants to go this way, why don't you do that first before you submit it to USED and see what you find out. Do your own sort of test run of peer review, since it has to be done in advance of you actually operationalizing this option for your districts.
And I would like to add, I did say, you met for most of them, but not all elements are created equal, right? So
That's very true.
Some of the ones where there are some holes were some of the biggest rocks that felt like the comparability, so.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we looked at all 30 elements in that peer review. that many existed then. Comparability isn't per se a critical element, but there's a lot of things it connects to. And the technical quality, let's say, reporting of results, achievement levels, all that stuff, and, it needs to be considered. But, bottom line is, at least as I understand the law and the letter that came out from Patrick Rooney and U.S. Department of Ed last year announcing this option to states, is that if you're going to be able to provide the option for districts to choose whatever test, then there's got to be some sort of level of comparability of the results, or you're going to have quite a mishmash of data to figure out what it all means. So, questions? Hand it back to you, Deborah.
Sure. Does anyone have questions? Yes.
Mitch, just real quick, as a result of the feasibility study, has Florida legislature kind of pumped the brakes on adopting a locally selected assessment? Have they pumped the brakes, or are they still wanting to move forward?
No, it was definitely a brake pumper. So I think, and again, I can only talk about Florida's. Every state's different, and the focus of the study was very specific. I think it's clear from this, because the legislators love our accountability system. They really like it, and our NAEP results have been very strong, and I don't think they want to upset the apple cart. Although your NAEP was at 4 and 8, I think they see how that feeds up into the readiness at the upper grades. So as far as the mix and match, I don't see them doing that. I don't think that there was anything in the report that would prevent them from adopting some other assessment other than the state's test. So it's just hard to read the tea leaves. We'll know. Session starts next March. We'll see.
I think there was another question over here, or no? Okay. Was there a question over here? Okay.
It was mentioned earlier that if one of these assessments had already gone through peer review through another state's submission, that you would just provide the evidence as pertinent to your state and then reference what had already been submitted. I'm wondering what that would look like. If you're part of a consortium, you would reference what the consortium submitted. But if you're not part of a consortium, what would you reference? Just what other states had submitted?
So one thing that you could do, Don mentioned that peer review notes are being posted online now. And so what you can do is just reference the peer review notes from that particular assessment. So if it's an assessment that's already been peer reviewed. So we have that, we're aware of it.
Thank you.
Yes, Lyra.
I just have a clarification question about the 7.3 requirement. So, as the requirement indicated, the implementation has got to be occurred after the peer review approved whatsoever. So the asking for peer review first and then implement. So I'm just looking at that requirement. See, something require empirical analysis. So the empirical analysis to me is like, since the implementation is not in place yet, so the empirical data could be collected from the other state, from national, or is there any specific? For instance, just take ACT as an example. There's tremendous empirical data based on college-bound student. So their probably reliability or some technical quality indicators shows the test is really technically sound. But when you use for the state high-stake accountability, you include college-bound, not college-bound student. So it's just a clarification for both sides. One side is how the state, if the state want to go to that direction, how to collect that data to be proved. On the other side is for the peers, when you review this kind of application, so what kind of evidence you're really expecting? It's just a clarification.
Yeah, I think, so I think we don't want to really go down the road of telling you what kinds of evidence to submit, and that's why, you know, we use some of these as examples in this, you know, in the right-hand column on the guide is, and as John mentioned, there are different ways to do this and to provide evidence, so I think I wouldn't want to be more specific, at least from the department. Now, if others on our panel have ideas about evidence that you could provide.
Well, a lot of it, LaRue, is, I mean, the stuff that I said, the first things to look at, comparing the different assessments, yeah, you just pull out the tech reports, you pull out these other summaries, and you look at those sort of technical characteristics and assume that the data that, and I will say their name on this one, that SAT has, that ACT has, that data, even though it's based on nationally representative samples, that is appropriate for your state with your specific sample students. It may or may not be based on demographics, but let's just assume it's more comparable than not. The trick is, and so you can look at a lot of different things. Now, yeah, if alignment studies have been done, okay, well, why not borrow from them unless your state content standards are so much different? Well, you're not so sure how that's going to work. Certainly Florida's were a lot different, but we were looking at set specific end of course standards there versus a general math or a general reading or ELA. So, and I think like Deborah said, accommodations, which had been an issue some years ago, doesn't seem to be quite so bad now with all the assessments providing pretty much similar collection of things, but it's still worth checking. When it comes down to that interchangeability of test scores, though, that's really tricky. And we spent a lot of time talking about it, and we had a whole team of experts and interacted with Florida a lot too, because who knows the data better than Florida, and Vince's psychometrician was very helpful. But I mean, to get the samples right so that we thought we could actually do the analysis to find out and do these classification analyses and decision consistency and the concordance table, that was hard. And because the data are what the data are. I mean, the best of all worlds, you do it, like if we went back to Florida and said, let's redo that study, you give every kid each of those 3 tests and next year, and then you've got a whole bunch of data. Same time frame, same everything, analyze it, then you'll kind of, you'd have some very pure results. We couldn't do that, and I don't know who can. So you had to take existing data, kids who had taken this test at this time, this other test at some other time, and do the best you can, and then somehow link it all up together, so equipercentile, and then analyze it to see where the kids would fall. Go ahead, Vince.
Yeah, I want to jump onto that. You mentioned the data you had previously. I mentioned that the students have to pass the ELA, the grade 10 ELA test and the Algebra 1 test to get a diploma. The state law also requires that the commissioner set concordance scores specifically on ACT and SAT that can be used if a student can't pass the statewide test. Well, we found out pretty quickly doing that work that it does matter when the kid takes the test. As we did this, and we used to look at just the entire body, all the kids that took the state test and all the kids that took ACT or SAT, lump them together and do your equipercentile linking from those big giant groups. Well, we got some really high scores. And what was clearer now than was ever clearer before, because we've done concordance scores before, was the amount of growth that occurs for those kids. So those same kids who took the test, took the state test and got, whatever the passing score is, when they took the ACT or SAT a year later, they scored very well. And what was more disparate, again, this is all things for you to think about if you have to do this, is really the comparability starts way back when you set standards on your statewide test, before you even contemplated using something outside of the state or ACT or SAT. I'll give you for an example. The cut score, we have 5 achievement levels. The lowest scale score in elite achievement level 3 is passing. When the ELA panel set the passing score on grade 10, they knew level 3 was going to be passing. And when they set that score, it was a very high mark. And when we restricted time, and we looked at the kids that took the SAT or ACT, or I'll just say the SAT, one comes to mind most quickly. When those kids took the SAT within a semester of that test, they scored a 480. When you didn't, and 480 is the college and career-ready cut score, right? So that was a 480. And then if you looked at the entire sample, those kids, if you look at the, you opened it up to unrestricted time span, it was up to a 500, which is really high. So if you use the 500, you're saying a kid has to be more than college and career ready to pass the statewide test. Conversely, when the Algebra 1 EOC standard setting group set that level 3 cut score, it's comparable to an ACT score of 16. And the complaint's like, how can you possibly make that comparison? The 16 is nowhere near college and career ready. Well, that ship has sailed. That standard setting took place in the fall of 2015, and that's what the panel, they didn't look at ACT or SAT scores. They looked at what they wanted students to know and be able to do in Algebra 1 in order to graduate from high school. And then you also have to look at the content alignment as well. So for policymakers, for those states that are considering this, you've got to think about what information the standard setting panelists had when they set standards on those tests, because that's what you're tying these new tests back to, something the ship's already sailed. So a big, long discussion in the state of Florida about that.
If I can add one other thing, this was mentioned earlier, but it was very difficult when we did the Florida studies because we had the baseline, which was the Florida tests that we're using, and then comparing those to the college entrance exams, the locally selected, nationally recognized. If the state assessment isn't part of the mix, and it's just going to be, the option is let districts pick one of the 2 college entrance exams, that changes things quite a bit on comparability. Now, I'm not here to evaluate how comparable SAT and ACT are, but you all are educated people. Many of you probably took one of those tests at some point in your career, right? Your kids, whatever, or you know somebody that took them. But anyway, there's been studies done. There are existing concordance tables anyway to match things up. You see what their frameworks are. They're basically designed to be college admissions tests. It takes a huge level of variability out of the equation, not having your high school assessment that has to be to meet all these other requirements. So, but I'm not setting the law in your states, and I don't know. I mean, can we ask you a question? So of the states who raised your hands, how many are looking at the whole collection, your existing high school assessment or SAT or ACT, that's part of the plan? Or another, yeah, option D. Okay, and how many are just looking at a college entrance exam or option C or D? Okay. Well, just something to think about.
Okay, so to wrap up, and and we do have time for additional questions, but we realize that this probably sounds pretty daunting to you. I wanted to ask each of our panelists to just give you some last thoughts, and that's it, to leave you with their last ideas.
Ladies first.
It's the second time you've done that today. I don't think I've ever heard that as much in one day.
My wife taught me well, I think.
I taught you well. Okay, well, thank you. Well, just hearing both of John and Vince's conversation, I think it really does go back to 7.1, which is where we started, and that's the content standards. So what we're all held to is assessing the content standards, and they're adopted by the state. And then the assessment that you use for that is an assessment that is, is developed in-house, developed by a vendor. It could be a nationally recognized assessment, but that expectation with alignment and the degree to that alignment, I think is critical to maintain. But I would also say that in North Carolina, I spent a lot of time saying to folks, the fact that the content standards establish those college career readiness expectations. And if you're doing that in your content standards, then it just creates that stream from there to the development of your assessments, to your standard setting and your reporting. And if it's all done well, it just kind of circles back. So I think the advice that I would give is just to make sure in this process that we don't lose that connection. There are reputable assessments out there that meet the criteria of being nationally recognized assessments for college entrance, but do they also uphold the expectations in the state that we establish what students know and are able to do with respect to college career readiness? And then the other thing I would say is, again, going back to 7.1 and 7.2, the recognition that the state is responsible for doing the process and having this process be one that they can monitor and that they can share in a clear way to make sure that the fidelity of the assessments is maintained over time.
I have a plaque that hangs in my office, was given to, oops, I'm glad that was empty. That was given to me by a former colleague, Chris Ellington, you may know her. And it's a quote from Walt Disney, and it says, "It's kind of fun to do the impossible." So I think that may apply here. So I think you can, being creative, you could make this happen. I think you really, as I mentioned, you're going to have to go back and look at standard setting. I think the comparability piece is the biggest part. And you're going to have to take a look at achievement levels and where those cut scores were set and be creative and how you're going to bring those back into line. And again, I think your current accountability system probably won't work. So you have to revisit that in order to make this happen.
So my words from a practical perspective, because mostly what I know about this is our work with Florida on that study and listening very carefully as I hear other states saying, well, we're doing this alignment study of SAT or ACT to state standards. Yes, that's going on a lot, but looking at other things too. So a practical approach is think this through carefully so that your state, if it's pushed down this road or voluntarily says, yes, this is what we want to do, be very clear on a design on how you can meet the critical elements in peer review and then get the data and conduct your studies that you need. You may need to have some flexibility too within your state, depending, especially if you're using your state assessment program. And like Vince said, your current achievement levels may need to be revisited. There may be a number of things that need to be kind of tweaked in there, but it's doable. So, having a clear design as you go in, and then, like I described, doing a mock peer review will give you a lot more information internally that you can kind of be aware of before you do the official peer review. And I think that's a good exercise to kind of go through, because that will then look at not just comparability, but a whole lot of things. And you'll know where you stand then before you take the next big step.
And that actually could work for any type of assessment that you're submitting for peer review, is this idea of a mock peer review, which I think is a good one. Okay. So with that, I'll open it up again for any questions.
Can I ask you, so will USED treat this submission kind of spatial, kind of speed up the process? So states will get the feedback as soon as possible?
We are looking at that, and we're going to kind of look at that on a state-by-state basis. But yes, we understand that the timing might not work if we say our next peer review is next summer. So yes, we will consider that. Patrick?
I would give one friendly amendment to what Deborah said. We definitely want to work with any states that are doing this for whether they want to, whether they feel they have to, whatever the case may be. Regardless, if this is something you're exploring, we definitely want you to talk to us. Talk to us early to let us know you're doing this. We're happy to give you some advice, and also that can help our planning so we can be more timely in our response. But don't expect that you can come in February and say, we're doing this in March, we need this approved, because we won't be able to do that. Like, we will need more time than that. We can try to be quick, but you all have been through peer review now, I think, and you know we're not, quick is a relative term for us. So don't expect a quick turnaround from us. And don't wait till the last minute and say, legislature just passed this, we have to do it now, because that is not likely to happen on our timeline.